Maquette is an indie puzzle game that explores an interesting core concept with an emphasis on atmospheric and mechanical storytelling. I'll leave it there and say I think it's neat. It probably won't blow you away, but it's a decently enjoyable time. If you're interested, the less you know the better, and the rest of the video will of course spoil you. The core concept of Maquette is that you explore and manipulate a recursive environment. After the prologue, you find yourself in a square surrounded by buildings. In the middle of the square, there is a miniature, or maquette, of the buildings around you. You are introduced to the game's central mechanic, picking up and placing items, and you soon discover that if you place an object somewhere in the maquette, say a small red cube in front of a miniature building, a large red cube will appear in front of the life-size building. Consequently, if you were to place your small red cube in front of one of the life-size houses, you'll find an eensy-weensy cube at the doorstep of the miniature. And this process is implied to go on forever, only ending for the player when the object becomes too big or too small to interact with. This is what a recursive environment is. The world repeats, and in this case gets bigger with each repetition, and any change you make to one iteration will be reflected across all iterations. This setup affords you two capabilities, manipulating the size of objects, and placing objects you might otherwise be unable to move in areas you might otherwise be unable to reach. This, and a touch of platforming, is the entirety of your toolkit for Maquette, and as the game progresses, the puzzles push this concept until it reaches a logical extreme. However, although this concept lends itself to a plethora of complex and demanding multifaceted puzzles, the puzzles, as puzzles, aren't actually Maquette's strongest facet. Rather, Maquette excels in leveraging this concept for the sake of atmosphere, and using said puzzles and atmosphere to complement the story, in a pretty remarkable way. Or I find it remarkable, and I'm gonna do that. Remark, that is. Usually when discussions of a game's atmosphere come up, the setting, visuals, and music are the main points of interest. Aesthetic atmosphere. But I find how a game uses its mechanics to create a distinct atmosphere as, if not more, interesting. The mechanical setup of a game inevitably contributes to its atmosphere, how the player feels in this space, and this contribution can be so significant it can easily outweigh the aesthetics. Simply look at the beautiful, serene-looking, overgrown cities of Last of Us and know this is not an atmosphere defined by serenity. The threat of enemies and the scarcity of resources likely take precedence over the feelings elicited by the aesthetics. That being said, games, or maybe just the games I've played, often tend not to leverage mechanical atmosphere to any remarkable extent. It usually comes off as incidental at most. But when you think about games that make strong use of it, games that create a mechanical atmosphere that is in notable service to the context of its respective game, the effect is evident. In some cases, the effect is extremely evident. There are a few aesthetic touches I'll go over in the credits, but the following analysis will mostly be concerned with mechanical atmosphere. Maquette features very little hand-holding and tutorialization. It teaches you to pick up and place items, but it doesn't go any further. It doesn't explain that the environment repeats, or that when you place a block here, you also place a larger block there. You are left to discover the nature of this recursive world on your own. Thanks to the opening puzzles, you'll learn quick enough that the maquette is in fact a maquette of the buildings around you. But it's on you to observe and consider your surroundings further to get the full picture. Is there a maquette of the maquette in the maquette? If you look into the distance, you might notice the massive columns and wonder if this repetition continues again, and maybe again. And if far beyond your field of view, there is a ridiculously large cube somewhere at the doorstep of an even larger building. These facts will become more and more obvious as you progress in the game, but everything you need to ascertain the entirety of your situation is present as soon as you step into it. As such, players will invariably come to their eureka moments at different times, and while the game will force them past a certain point with its puzzles, you'll likely come to a few of them on your own before that. This, I think, constructs a distinct atmosphere, and if I had to describe it, I'd point to a sense of wonder and uncertainty. Once you come to some realization about the world, you'll feel a sense of wonder, but you'll also start to wonder if there are more details you haven't noticed. There was more to the world than you initially thought. What's to say there isn't yet more? The puzzles continue to reinforce this notion throughout. A lot of Maquette's puzzles are what I'd refer to as matter-of-fact puzzles. They don't require much creativity or wit, merely comprehension of your surroundings and your toolkit. The challenge tends to lie in figuring out your options, and once your options are understood, the solution is, well, matter-of-fact. The game can and probably will stump you, but in retrospect, the solution will always seem obvious, as if you've noticed something that was under your nose all along. There's a recurring trick the game employs throughout to achieve this effect. Let's look at some examples. The greenhouse and the wall. In the third chapter, you're presented with different colored houses and crystals. Each of the houses have colored barriers, and you need to be holding the corresponding crystal to pass through. You need the green crystal to get through the door of the green house, but you need the pink crystal to enter the house proper. To get the pink crystal through the green barrier, you take it to the Maquette version and drop it through this opening. When you get inside, you find a key. Now, since you need to be holding a crystal to get back out, it's clear that there's no way to leave the house with the key. Luckily, there is a conspicuous and conveniently shaped window in the back of the house for you to push the key through. Once you're outside, you can pick up the small version of the key from the back of the Maquette. You leave the greenhouse using either of the crystals, and leaving the other behind, make your way to the next house to find... You need both crystals to enter this one too. How do you get both crystals out of the greenhouse when you need to be carrying one of them to exit? Well, if you remember what you just did with the key, you might start looking around and... another conveniently shaped hole, only this time much less conspicuous. A lot of the preceding puzzles in this chapter were concerned with examining the houses to find entrances and exits. I already showed 2 examples. Their purpose was immediately obvious once you found them. It's clear what this is for, but this one isn't. This... lattice? Is this a lattice? Seems at first just to be an aesthetic touch in the design of the house. Once you realize that these seemingly superfluous details may actually serve a purpose, you start to... wait, my crystal's too big. There we go. The next example, the wall puzzle at the end of the same chapter, made me feel like an idiot. After completing the prior puzzle, a bridge appears leading you to a cog. The cog hole to slot it into has been hanging over you for the entire chapter. You know where this goes, but when you go to place it, the wall appears, and a pink crystal. This type of crystal was introduced at the beginning of the chapter, and you learned that you need to press your crystal to it to make it dematerialize the wall. But how do you get to it? This one stumped me for a while. I can shimmy the cog through here? Okay. The game gates off areas that have already been completed, so for now, you're stuck in this one plot. Inevitably, you will check the back wall, and text appears to let you know you're on the right track. Can I drop the crystal over the wall? Yes! But now what? I spent a lot of time trying to get the crystal to roll down the stairs so it would hit the wall and I could grab it through the bars, but no dice. What the hell other option is there? Now, if I show you this image, I imagine you'd see the solution almost immediately. Look how clearly telegraphed it is. However, up until this point in the game, the player has been playing within the bounds of 2 recursions. If you were sneaky, you could have broken into the 3rd recursion in the prior chapter, but if not, you may not consider it a possibility. I didn't. Also, up until this point, the game has not featured platforming in any meaningful way. You have a jump, but it seems pretty anemic, the game never demanded its use, and I at least assumed that it was merely meant to help you navigate over the walls of the Maquette. As clear as this telegraphing is, I didn't consider this an option at all. Eventually, when I was at my wit's end, I Google figured it out, and even so, this was one of the more impactful aha moments in the game. What I had been overlooking as mere aesthetic touches before now stood out as platforms, and going forward, I began to see them everywhere. As with the greenhouse, I started to see what I had been disregarding as mere aesthetic touches in a new light. This is what Maquette does. This is its trick. It lulls you into a false sense of understanding, only for the puzzles to later exploit those misconceptions to challenge you. It introduces things far before they become relevant, leaving you to write those things off as superficial until you're forced to reconsider them. When it came to platforming, the game gave you the ability to jump from the get-go, yet didn't ask you to use it for what may be around a couple hours. There was a third recursion, off in the distance from the get-go, but you weren't pushed to go there for a couple hours. The lattice served as inconspicuous set dressing for 2 puzzles before it became relevant. Then there's the staircase in Chapter 4. It's a nice staircase. It has these little things on them. Throughout the 4th chapter, you use the staircase as you would by going up the stairs, until you have to consider that these little things are actually doorways, that the grooves in the side of the staircase are there for a reason. It's not a nice staircase, it's 3 staircases. This design philosophy is instrumental in the construction of Maquette's mechanical atmosphere, wonder and uncertainty. You come to realize that the superficial is actually functional. You notice something that was under your nose all along. And if that thing had managed to go unnoticed for so long, then what's to say there aren't more things hiding in plain sight? And this atmospheric identity is complemented, of course, by the physical space you inhabit, the recursive world itself. Looking at the maquette, you get a good sense of the big picture. You understand the layout and the features of the buildings around you, but once you venture into the life-size version, you'll notice more of the minutiae. The little details are more significant, the larger more imposing. What was but a negligible crack in the wall might now be a tunnel. What were small superficial touches might now be obvious platforms. Then you notice the next recursion, Titanic, looming eerily in the distance, once again suggesting that there may be yet more about this same space that you haven't been considering. That although everything is exactly how it appears, you aren't fully comprehending it, and no matter how many recursions you venture through, there's always another beyond it. Yeah, I think the atmosphere of Maquette is quite striking, and it has a marked effect on the player. Since you're so frequently reminded that every detail may hold some relevance you're not seeing, you're more likely to start looking deeper into everything. However, the truth of the matter is, no, most things are purely aesthetic. This is a short and shallow game that doesn't push its concept, puzzles, and most disappointingly its environments very hard at all. I don't want to give you the impression that this game is anything more than 6 out of 10? Yeah, that seems fair. Oh, wait, yeah, I just fell through the floor. It's a decently satisfying time for your first playthrough, but there probably isn't as much as you would want to do here. You're mostly being strung along by the pervasive notion that there might be. This is the game leveraging its atmosphere to provide the illusion of depth to a world that is mostly quite shallow, and that's kinda cool. The game features beautiful set pieces, and the atmosphere will gear you to approach them with a certain trepidation. I often found myself exploring for a good long while, even though there was little point to. And it's not like I was intentionally misled by the game to do so. It was just a consequence of how the game made me feel. It's an interesting way to incentivize the player to make the most of the environments themselves to make up for the game not doing so. That being said, would this game benefit from giving you extrinsic reasons to explore? Secrets, collectibles, things to find by placing objects in creative ways and exploring the environment? Yes, it would. That would be nice. There's one. The game has one. When you first enter the third recursion, you can sneak through this small crack. You can then enter the doghouse and find pictures of the developer's pets. This one's my favorite. Look at his silly face. But where are the developer's cars? Pictures of their hobbies. Their mother's maiden names, their nudes. This is squandered potential. There is a lot of squandered potential to leverage the concept and do the environment a bit more justice. Size manipulation and massive environments lend themselves perfectly to a platformer. But unfortunately, platforming ends up playing a very minor role, only being the focus of one chapter when it could have been far more prevalent throughout in an optional capacity. You can break into the third recursion as early as the second chapter, but there's barely anything to find there until the fourth. You can break into the fourth recursion in the fourth chapter, and while I do feel quite clever for figuring out how to do that, it doesn't even exist. There could have been tons of things to find in nooks and crannies, platforming paths that only become obvious in larger recursions, reasons to play around with the mechanics. I want to climb the castle, man, but I digress. The world of Maquette is somewhat of a glass onion when it comes to gameplay. It's still decently enjoyable for a first playthrough, but it's hard not to consider what more could have been done by the end of it. Nonetheless, the atmosphere stands. It is striking, it is consistently and effectively reinforced, and while the world failed to live up to it, the story rose to the occasion. Surprisingly so for me, you'll see what I mean, because it's really not the story being told, but how it's being told. How it worked so well with the atmosphere, and a theme I think it was trying to convey. The story of Maquette details the rise and fall of a relationship between Michael and Kenzie. They connected over drawing, they shared a sketchbook, they got together for a while, they grew distant, they broke up, and at some point after the relationship, Michael finds their sketchbook, and it gets him to thinking. He writes a letter to Kenzie, going through their relationship in retrospect, detailing significant events, how he felt at the time, and what the relationship did to him as it progressed. The story of Maquette is this letter, or Michael's experience reminiscing and writing it. As you progress through the puzzles, lines from the letter appear, and occasionally you're treated to audio clips of the couple interacting.
Knock yourself out.
To put it bluntly, the story is simple. Mundane, shallow, and incredibly cliché. Depending on your disposition, it can also be quite cheesy, quite touching, or both. As soon as the game starts, you know how it's going to go. The framing device immediately implies that they're going to break up, and the story of their relationship is as by the books as it gets. You've seen this kind of thing before. The story doesn't paint the most detailed picture of the characters and their relationship. Rather, it provides just enough context to get the ideas across. Despite introducing a fair amount of particulars, those particulars don't give much in the way of solid characterization. My unfinished cans of seltzer abandoned everywhere. Okay, Michael is lazy, messy, forgetful, making odd territorial power plays with his garbage? Sure, one of those. Whatever, and the seltzer, the one particular on offer here, adds, fittingly I guess, little flavor to his character either. Michael truly is one of the humans of all time. He gets thirsty. It's relatable, and the rest of the particulars are leveraged as so. He bought expensive salt and pepper shakers. Okay. They took a trip somewhere called Marin. Okay. Kenzie bought some crystals on the beach. Cool. These are particulars, but they're all so colorless that they can easily map onto whatever experiences you've had in your relationships. I think that was the intent. Applicability and relatability. Yet, as a result, you don't leave with the firmest grasp on who these characters are. Your little quirks weren't so little anymore. What quirks?
You sons of bitches. Exactly.
You do get a vague sense of Michael and Kenzie, a few character traits, shared interests, a touch of their histories, a taste of their chemistry, but not much more than that. They are, for the most part, average American couple you've probably seen on TV. And the decline of the relationship is also fittingly devoid of character. They just grow apart. The passion dies. There may be more to it than what we see, but we don't see it. This all sounds like high praise, I know, but I actually think this straightforward, cliché story and its lack of detail works for what this game is going for. The experience is more about the atmospheric, mechanical, and environmental storytelling, supplementing and I would even say completing the story with the world and gameplay. As such, there is a good level of interpretation required from the player to get much of anything out of the experience. A simple, cliché story works well to this end because you'll know what the story is going for, so it's easier to relate it to the more subtle machinations of the game. Also, clichés are cliché for a reason. This story is relatable, and the lack of particularization just makes it more so. There's a good amount of negative space that you can easily apply your own experiences to. And finally, the shallowness of the story can, I think, work as an incentive to start looking for more depth. Overall, the story gives the player a lot of space and a reason to derive meaning from the environment and gameplay. It gives just enough context to get the ball rolling. And that's just it. Context. the cutscenes, the lines of the letter, the text of the story serves more as context in this case, while the gameplay and the imagery of the game world serves as subtext, leaving the actual text, as it were, the complete story, to be implied by the player somewhere between the two. Hence the game placing a lot of burden on the player to get the most out of the narrative. That being said, there are many touches in the world and gameplay to provide subtext to or reinforce the story. The burden is on the player to derive meaning from them merely because they aren't belabored. They aren't pointed out or insisted upon, and many details are easily ignored or straight up missable. It's not pretentious in its storytelling, which really struck me because when you hear indie game about a relationship, you'd probably presume otherwise. What I really respect here is that while the game was clearly designed with conveying the story in mind, it doesn't feel as if the story is coming at the expense of the gameplay. If you want to play this game for the gameplay and you don't stop to smell the hand-drawn roses, you'll have a somewhat satisfying puzzle game with a neat concept, a distinct atmosphere, and an unremarkable but relatively unobtrusive story. I think you'd still enjoy it for the most part. The game has a satisfying mechanical arc, and you don't really need to contextualize it with the narrative to appreciate it. If you do stop to smell the roses though, there are a lot of aromas to appreciate. But of course, you need to stop and smell them. However, I think the game is very well poised to facilitate that. This is where the atmosphere comes into play. The superficial is functional. There may be more to what you're seeing, and since you know that, you're more liable to read into everything, meaningful or not. Again, leveraging the atmosphere to provide the illusion of depth to something otherwise shallow. But when it comes to a story, as opposed to a building that objectively doesn't have nudes in it, I don't know if there's a difference between illusion and reality in that sense. A story, or rather what you derive from it, is already an illusion, something you can see that may differ from what others do. Anyway, generally speaking, the game has two ways of complementing the story that it tends to employ simultaneously. The first is through eliciting appropriate reactions in the player through game design. A very basic example is found with the wall puzzle. As I've gone over, you've been waiting to acquire the cog for the entirety of the chapter because the cog hole has been glaring at you from the start. When you finally get it and make your way to the cog hole, the wall appears to block your path, accompanied by the line, "Even when we disagreed." Simple and clean. The notion of a disagreement married with an unexpected obstacle. The player feels annoyed and a little betrayed. Just when you thought you finally had it, the game isn't just telling you about a disagreement. It's leveraging player expectation to make you feel that disagreement. You're not actually privy to any disagreement. The text doesn't tell you what their disagreements were, yet you still have an appropriate emotional reaction. And since the disagreements aren't tied to any particulars, you're free to apply your own experiences. I remember the disagreements with my ex-girlfriend. She told me she wasn't real. I disagreed. When you go to the back wall, the line, "We could always see each other's side" appears. At this point, you'll likely be relieved, satisfied, or reassured. The fact that text is appearing implies you're on the right track. You're close to solving the puzzle. Again, the emotional response is elicited by player expectation, not the content of the text. The gameplay is working in tandem with the story, giving more girth to the otherwise thin text. I don't know why I said it that way. It's also just a nice touch that this line appears on the other side of the wall, right? It's cute. A far more striking example is the entirety of the 5th chapter, which details Michael's depression after leaving Kenzie. I remember the time. This is the only chapter, besides the prologue, that takes place entirely outside of the usual Maquette area. Instead, you're on a linear path, and along the way, you get locked in small rooms, confronted with some of the toughest curveball puzzles in the game. During the Maquette chapters, you could leave and walk around, consider other options, appreciate the scenery, but here, you're forced to confront these simple but obtuse problems, and there's no way to ignore them. As you're not in the usual recursive environment, each puzzle offers a unique framework of the mechanics. They feel like deconstructions of the familiar system. This puzzle has you placing beams on the floor in this room to manipulate the larger beams on the wall in that room. The next puzzle has you placing keys in different basins to manipulate their size, and the final puzzle, probably the hardest in the game, has you placing small structures on separate planes while large versions appear in the same coordinates on a single plane. In this chapter, not only are there the puzzles to consider, but you need to get to grips with the fundamentals of how each room functions. You have to figure out how any of this shit works before you can try to achieve anything with it. Accompanied by lines like, "I didn't know who I was anymore," and "I asked myself if we were ever a good fit." Aw, and we're trying to find a key that fits. That's cute. I think this section worked very well. Feeling as if your whole world has been deconstructed. Being stuck in a dark place, confronted with the task of learning to walk again. This chapter did a solid job of conveying these feelings with the game design. This section can feel monotonous, claustrophobic, frustrating, and, at times, hopeless. There's something very triggering about not knowing what to do when the puzzle you're faced with has so few variables. Like, what do you want from me, game? Are these lights important? Did that do anything? Again, leveraging the player experience to add weight to the text. Not only making the player feel what Michael felt, but presenting obstacles that are representative of the experience he went through. And that brings me to the second and most prevalent way the game complements the story: the use of symbolism and imagery. Either the game will employ images with common connotations, such as a church to allude to the notion of marriage, a bridge to that of connection, or color coding, such as blue for boy and pink for girl, or the text will allude to the significance of a certain symbol. It will create certain associations between it and some aspect of the story, and then the game will leverage that symbol throughout to make certain implications for the player to interpret. An example is Kenzie's secret place that she shares with Michael early in their relationship. The text makes it clear that this represents something very personal to Kenzie, a place where she can be alone, and her sharing it with Michael is indicative of trust and of her opening herself fully to him. This secret place and its signature owl statue recurs a couple of times at different stages of the story and in different locations. And while the text never mentions it again, the player can derive something from when and where it appears and what function it serves. It appears in the third chapter, which details the honeymoon phase of the relationship, in the back of the greenhouse, which the text implies is a home they imagine sharing. It makes sense her secret place would be represented here, as a shared home is an extension of what the secret place represented, a shared privacy between them, a symbol of their trust. Seeing it here kinda sells the fantasy of this house in a way the text isn't able to. It wordlessly connects this place to the intimacy expressed in that previous scene, whereas the actual text here is going off on some other shit entirely.
Imagine a fridge, same size overall, but countertop height, laid out horizontally. Everything is accessible.
Wait, hold up, let him cook. And it's relevant to gameplay. This is the conveniently shaped window that you pushed the key through. Whatever this room represents is tied to progression in this case. You could imply that it is still relevant to or present in the relationship. And if you look out the window, you'll see it's pointing to the next recursion of this house, as if to imply that this house is where whatever this room represents will lead. Its next appearance is in the chapter detailing the decline of the relationship, at the back of the dilapidated church. Actually, I quite like how the game used the church. In the preceding chapter, The Height of the Relationship, each plot around the maquette held a single palatial building. In this chapter, they feature multiple separate buildings, I'm guessing to reflect the couple growing apart, except for the church. It's the only building that has its own plot, retains some of the grandeur of those from the former chapter, and of course it has obvious marital connotations. The chapter opens with you at its doorstep. You can sneak into it through a crack in the third recursion. You can place the staircase in front of it in the second recursion and check out the higher floors. You can explore it completely whenever you want, but you never have to. It doesn't factor into the puzzles until the very end of the chapter. Until then, it just lingers there conspicuously, like something Michael is keeping in the back of his head. For such an imposing building with such severe connotations, you probably expect some mechanical and/or narrative payoff when you finally open the door. Perhaps a particularly interesting puzzle or an important cutscene. But when you do, nothing happens. There's a bit of unrelated text and a short scene indicating that your next point of interest is the bell, and that's it. You immediately turn around and exit, leaving the secret place irrelevant and possibly unnoticed at the back of the church. Getting to the bell is so simple it barely qualifies as a puzzle. Just use the stairs. You never have to go to the massive iteration of the church in the third recursion where it's at its most imposing. Rather, the chapter ends with you interacting with the Maquette version of it, where it's at its most trivial. And then you're treated to a cutscene of the couple having an explosive argument.
You're saying I'm not listening and you're the one that's not listening.
If you look through the window of the secret place, you can see through the now open doors of the church to the next recursion of this window. Something about this got me. We technically have a direct line of sight to the infinite here, through infinite empty churches. The feelings this image evokes are hard to parse. I take this whole segment to mean that for a while, as the couple was growing apart, Michael still held out hope. He had an idealized future in his mind, keeping him from leaving. He presumably pictured them getting married and related this to the intimacy they shared in the secret place scene when the relationship was just getting started.
I've never shown this to anyone, Michael.
And I see finding the secret place pointing to itself infinitely through countless empty churches to represent a realization of the emptiness of this sentiment. But it's not just that it represents that, it conveys that. There's just something eerie about looking at this. I feel it, you know? That pit in my stomach. That realization of, oh, I think I made you up inside my head. Isn't that crazy, babe? Consequently, you could just not notice the secret place at all, in which case you could just infer that whatever it represents has been forgotten or become irrelevant. Then again, you wouldn't be able to infer that because you wouldn't know, because you haven't noticed it. Games. Regardless, the accompanying text and the cutscene again doesn't reference the imagery. In this case, there's nothing about marriage being discussed. If the text had concerned it, the use of this imagery would boil down to visual or mechanical accompaniment for the sake of it, which isn't bad, mind you. Edith Finch is that, and it's excellent. But in this case, the imagery and the gameplay work to provide something the text is lacking. While the text conveys the steady decline of the relationship, the imagery and gameplay, the discovery and gradual understanding of what you're looking at and its relevance, conveys Michael's realization of the state of his relationship. And it does so by giving the player some authority in this realization. You are the one coming to a realization. The text presents the situation, whereas the player's input and reading of the game world works to convey how Michael conceptualizes it all. To reiterate, the text is context, the game offers subtext, and you are to imply the actual text in between. This fight may be the moment he accepted they weren't gonna end up together, and then the game undermines this moment entirely by spelling it out with the title card of the next chapter, that the future he envisioned was nothing more than a thought. That Kenzie was nothing more than a thought. It's also worth mentioning that the church may not represent marriage. That's just my first interpretation. It could be a symbol of the divine. Yeah. Think about it. Probably the most significant symbol in the game, besides the maquette itself, are the crystals. The blue crystal, which I think is meant to represent Michael as a bachelor, the green crystal to represent him as changed by the relationship, and most notably, the pink orb introduced in Chapter 2. The pink orb is contextualized first as a crystal bowl for fortune-telling. Kenzie was apprehensive about getting her fortune told because Zoltar killed her turtle.
It was a Galapagos turtle.
No, it wasn't.
But Michael's willing to give it a go. Although upon receiving his fortune, he admits it was a bad one. The fortune is never revealed. We can assume it foretold the end of Bayonetta 3, but we can't be certain. The pink orb could represent Kenzie herself, what Michael is attracted to in her, his connection to her, perhaps the rose-colored glass he views her through, or she views him through, or it could represent their future, the notion of a grim prophecy that Michael will go on to risk fulfilling. Maquette is the only game I've played in which I literally ponder my orb. This orb goes on to have a lot of mechanical significance. In this chapter, it's hosted within the key that you use as a bridge to Kenzie's secret place. You use it to open the door to Kenzie's friend's house, where the two establish their relationship, and you can even use it to prematurely break into the third recursion. In Chapter 3, the honeymoon phase, the orb is central to solving every puzzle. It has the ability to dissolve barriers, and while other crystals will get you through the door of all the houses, the pink orb will get you into the important rooms. It gets you into the main room of the blue house, where we find the green crystal, and we're treated to the scene in which they first say, "I love you." To leave this house with the new crystal, we need to leave the blue crystal behind, locked in the house. I take this to mean that Kenzie has brought out a new side of Michael, but in doing so, Michael left a part of himself behind. His independence, perhaps. It's like when I started going out with my girlfriend, and I had to stop fucking her sister. Whatever this pink orb represents, it is clearly an incredibly important aspect of Michael's psyche during this period. And of course, in the next chapter, the decline of the relationship, when the characters retreat into themselves and grow distant, it's not featured at all. It appears again in the chapter after that, the escape that goes over the breakup. In this chapter, you walk off into the distance, out into the mahoosive fourth recursion. There aren't any puzzles here, none that use the core mechanics of the game at least. Instead, you have to look through the pink orb to reveal pathways you can't see otherwise, as you walk through this canyon littered with shattered blue and green crystals. And at the end of the chapter is this tiny, easily missable detail. These two dead butterflies. But when you don't look through the crystal, they're alive. A clear indication that we can't keep looking through this rose-tinted glass. Whatever the crystal represented, how integral it was to solving the puzzles and opening up the world, we can't use it to keep moving forward anymore. And maybe it didn't always lead us in the best direction. Maybe we shouldn't have abandoned the blue crystal. Then the game undermines this moment immediately with this unavoidable visual at the beginning of the next chapter. Gee, I wonder what that could mean. I'm at the end of the segment. I don't want to close off on a negative. It's cool that you can only see the shattered crystals by looking through the orb, and that none of them are on the beaten path. You need to divert yourself from progressing to find them. It's as if Michael is too concerned with ruminating on his situation to keep moving forward. It's nice, it's subtle, and there's just something to be said about the missable nature of these details. Finding them is a direct result of your agency, rather than merely your participation, and as a result you feel somewhat responsible for them. And this feeling of responsibility just makes them hit harder. I don't know how to put it. I'm done. And yeah, those are just a few examples of how the game leverages symbolism and player expectation that I found significant. It's not setting the world on fire, but it's cool, right? And I really am just scratching the surface. There's a lot more to look into. The design of the buildings. What are you doing here? The order in which you go to them. Their progression throughout chapters. Instances of color. The inside of the maquette is green, but the outside is pink. Oh shit. The nature of and solution to the puzzles. Why is the key to the church in a mousetrap? Ow! The images that accompany the cutscenes, the music that plays occasionally. How this all relates to the sketchbook. Phallic and yonic imagery, anyone? This tower is a vagina. The cog represents... What does the cog represent? You could get very deep into a reading of this game if you want to, assigning intentionality to and or finding relevance in the smallest details. And while, yes, this is true of any piece of art, I hope I've explained how this game in particular incentivizes, facilitates, and rewards this kind of reading. The game requires this kind of interpretation for the story to start hitting, but once you start engaging on this level, where do you stop? The staircase is a masculine symbol because it's comprised of straight lines and angles. We retrieved it from the greenhouse, which you know was meant to represent Michael, and the colors of the staircase are inherently masculine or neutral. There is no femininity here, except for the arches. You thought you could hide behind a male-coded color, did you? Is it meaningful that these arches signpost the solution to this puzzle? Is it meaningful that the player is presumably going to overlook these at first? The challenge of this puzzle is to rediscover the feminine because we've been too preoccupied with the masculine. Michael's not giving Kenzie enough attention, is he? Once you notice an example of the game surreptitiously complementing the story, you start looking for them or just seeing them everywhere. And this can lead to some emergent readings? Is that a term? Here's an example of what I mean. Early in the game, I noticed the gazebo on top of the maquette. I call it a gazebo now, but I guess I didn't examine it too closely during my first playthrough because I was under the assumption it was a house. It's far too small for us to enter, but I thought that may be where the game would ultimately take us. We would climb the maquette in one of the larger recursions and enter it. Throughout the story, there is the recurring idea of the couple's dream house, something they're working towards, and I assumed that this gazebo was supposed to represent the dream house. Cut to the final chapter, the relationship is over, and it's gone. There's a hole where it used to be. This hit me as a really cool touch, not in the least because it was such a subtle detail that could have easily been overlooked. The thing I thought was our end goal mechanically, and what Michael thought was his end goal narratively, ended up not being so. subverting player expectation to complement the subversion of Michael's, or at least just reflecting the story with the environment and keeping it consistent. This hole confirmed my suspicion of what this house represented. But upon my repeat inspection and discovering that this house isn't a house, it's a gazebo, I'm pretty sure that it's not supposed to represent the dream house, and I don't know why I ever thought going inside it would have been a goal. There doesn't seem to be an inside to go into. It might mean something, it probably means something, but you know, most of what I appreciated about this cool touch came from me. I was attributing intentionality to something that was likely coincidental, but I will hold that my experience was a direct consequence of this game's atmosphere. There's clearly more to what you're looking at than what you're seeing. There's clearly meaning in the environment, but there's no clear distinction between what is and isn't meant to be meaningful, so you're more liable to read into anything. And while this story is ultimately about a relationship, I think one of the themes this game is trying to convey is actually about this, about the way you read this game, about art in general. The recursive environment, the matter-of-fact puzzles, and the game leaving you to discover the nature of this world on your own, these elements consistently reinforce the idea that there is more to what you're looking at than what you're seeing, to entice you to start taking a closer look. The story provides just enough context to act as a lens to interpret what you're looking at through, while not narrowing the interpretive space with too many details or particulars. And the game ultimately provides enough meaningful imagery to interpret, earning, in my eyes, any instance of the player looking too deep into the imagery that may not have been intended to be meaningful. And although there is much to criticize about Maquette, a lot of untapped potential in its concept, its environments, and its puzzles not pushing the buck nearly as far as they could, I found the cohesion of its storytelling, its puzzle design, its environment, its atmosphere, and its theme impressively strong. Everything complements everything else. It all just fits really well. Using the environment and game design not merely to bolster, not merely to reflect, but to complete the story, and incentivizing the player to take authority over that completion wordlessly through atmosphere, while not sacrificing the integrity of a mechanically satisfying gameplay experience and not coming off as pretentious. That is well done. That is well fucking done, man. Graceful decay. Art. Dude, I like it. It's cool. I hope you do more stuff. And in the end, it all comes back to that sketchbook. The sketchbook that caused Michael to reminisce and write this letter. At first, I thought drawing was just a random interchangeable interest to have Michael and Kenzie relate over. It could be leveraged to contextualize the environments. These are the buildings they drew together. And adorn the cutscenes. Look at the flowers. Oh no, they're going away. But it's more than that. It's the theme of the game. Michael looked at some sketches and he saw the history of his relationship. He saw so much more than was actually on the page. That is the nature of experiencing art, and while, yeah, that's a pretty basic sentiment, Maquette illustrates and celebrates it wonderfully. It's a piece of art about experiencing a piece of art that actually does that premise some justice. There can always be more to what you're looking at than what you're seeing. The tiniest details can make the largest impact. And anything can be a platform if you're really fucking small. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. So here are the aesthetic touches I wanted to point out. Firstly, the presentation is great. I think the visuals probably spoke for themselves throughout the video, but I just wanted to say it regardless. Secondly, the sound design is seriously excellent. Although the world repeats, the music, or rather soundscape, changes with each iteration. When you're in the Maquette, you have these eerie tracks that suggest some kind of mystery to this world. In the life-size recursion, you have environmental soundscapes depending on which plot you're in. The sound of wind, birds twittering here and there. Maybe the sound of waves. But there's no sea. There are no birds. They feel close, but just out of sight. When you enter the massive third recursion, those sounds are accompanied by this unsettling, bassy rumble, as if the wind has been pitched down, as if the air itself is heavier. It feels like you're not supposed to be here. While all of the themes lend each recursion a particular identity, they all work to convey similar feelings of dreaminess? Feelings of unease and foreboding. What is this place? Accompanied by the sound of my footsteps, throughout the entire game I felt very aware that I was alone. It's all just eerie. Thirdly, is this. The thundering clunks of you dropping these massive objects in the distance is such a good touch. This one detail alone did so much for the sake of immersion. To add, well, weight to the concept of the recursive world. And it's just ominous. You hear this unseen clang, informing you that your small action evidently had much larger consequences than it appeared to. It's a great effect. Overall, while this video was about mechanical atmosphere, the aesthetic atmosphere of Maquette is really quite excellent as well. Kudos to the artists, programmers, and sound designers. Oh, and whoever did the DualSense features. Great use of haptics and the internal speaker. And before I go, there is one more thing to touch on. Now, I have spoiled most of this game, yeah, it's quite short, but there is one thing I've kept secret. This is the coolest thing in the game. If there's any part of you considering playing, don't watch this and know that there's something to look forward to that hasn't been spoiled. I've alluded to it a few times in this video. I said that this game pushes its concept to its logical extreme. I said it has a satisfying mechanical arc, that the most significant symbol in the game is the maquette itself, and that the player experience completes the story. So how does the story end? Michael recovers from his depression and picks himself up again. He meets Kenzie one last time and they leave on good terms. She's moving away. The ending does not imply that they will get back together. In fact, I don't even think it's implied that he sent this letter, but the possibility is not shut off, I guess. Rather, we are left with Michael having grown for the experience. But has he though? How? We don't get any indication from the text or the cutscenes as to how Michael has grown. I wouldn't say there's any noticeable change in his attitude or personality, and of course the game didn't even establish distinct shortcomings for him to overcome. From what we saw of the decline of their relationship, the two just became distant and retreated into their own lives. This happens, people become complacent, the passion dies. But how do you portray someone growing from a failed relationship when there's so little to work with? Well, you can feel it. It's this. The maquette is now an object for you to manipulate, and you control the entire world. This is just so fucking cool. This is the logical extreme of the concept. This is how you feel Michael's growth. The puzzles in this segment are some of the easiest in the game, and all rely on you exercising this new power you've attained. You need to make it to this tower in a certain amount of time. Move the tower closer to you. These stairs are too steep to climb. Tilt the universe. No longer are you at the mercy of the recursive environment. It is at yours. And aw shit, we're mending the blue crystals, baby. Michael's back. I take this section to mean that the relationship, the maquette, what was an entire world that Michael existed in, is now just a part of him. A world he carries within him and can leverage as he continues his life. He has a greater degree of agency over how he perceives his time with Kenzie. He's got an emotional and physical distance and gained perspective for it. He can look at it objectively, because it's an object now. He's become more powerful than you could possibly imagine. He's simply grown from the experience. You can feel it.
What are you watching?
Just some trash.